Okay, thank you everyone. Yes, today I just want to talk about some work that I've been involved in on Kangaroo Island over the last few years. Basically looking at some of the diversity of some of the understory mallee species, particularly in relation to the 2007 large-scale bushfire that went through there, and just sort of talk about that and what we're finding in relation to some of the issues we have in terms of planning ecological burning in South Australia. Aside from our life and property protection burns, which we identify particularly in the Mount Lofty region, but other regions as well, ecological areas and how we apply fire in those are primarily dictated by the Ecological Fire Management Guidelines, which is the document we have, which looks at broad-scale veg groupings, in this case major vegetation subgroups, part of the NVIS national system, and looks at the most fire-sensitive species in there, primarily plants in this case, and tries to derive some thresholds that basically relate to how soon can we put fire back into the landscape without damaging the species composition, and how long or should we leave it until they start senescing and dying. So what's the maximum length of time we could put into the system. So essentially we get therefore three veg categories, so recently burnt, a medium age category and a long unburnt category, which is trying to aim for those conservation of those hollow-dependent fauna type species as well. And as part of the guidelines we allocate a percentage that we'd like within each of these age categories. So we'd like at least 40% in the middle age category, at least 30% in the old age category, and whatever's left, 0 to 30% in the recently burnt category. Obviously with categories you're going to need some sort of mosaic application of burning, which is a challenging process because there's a whole lot of other things. Like I said, the life and property protection burns, there's certain species and all sorts of things. And one of the issues which come out of this Kangaroo Island work is the variability in species compositions and how that might impact how we do that. So as a general overview, consider that you've got a fairly homogeneous landscape, so whereas site A, B and C might all have fairly similar species compositions. So in real terms, where you put your treatment block should cover most of those species in terms of a regeneration aspect. But if you've got a highly variable landscape, particularly under these broad class MVS type veg categories, there's potential that you can get a whole range of different species that maybe not be covered by a fire treatment in terms of your 30, 40, 30 breakdown that's dictated by the guidelines. So, and it's useful to try and think about those things when we're actually applying these ecological fire regimes. As an example, I'm going to talk about the Kangaroo Island of Monitoring of Biodiversity Assets, or KIMBA. That was a biodiversity baselines project that was set up in the western end of Kangaroo Island in 2002, primarily just to have a baseline of what's there, so if a disturbance or something changed, they'd know and have some comparative sort of power to look at what's happened. As it turned out, the 2007 bushfire burnt pretty much the whole area. All the 25 sites that they set up then were located in MVS 29, which is in our guidelines is mallee, heath and shrubland, but there's been a subsequent revision in the MVS system. It's now called mallee with dense shrubby understory. So these sites were surveyed in 2002 and again in 2004. The fire came through and we've gone back and resurveyed in 2011 and 2013. We only had resources to do 16 sites out of the 25 for the plants. So we've done all 6 Eucalyptus diversifolia and 10 of the Eucalyptus remota populations. We're hoping this information will help us in our fire management. Here's an image of the site. You can see our Eucalyptus remota sites are the red dots, and remota populations are mostly in the middle of this patch here. Diversifolia is more of a coastal mallee type stuff around this edge, and the other green sites are the ones we didn't get back to. But interestingly, we've got all 25 sites. We have bird surveys at a spring and autumn across 5 different years, so there's a really good bird data set which I'm still yet to analyse and compare that to the plants as such. So what did we find when we looked at this stuff? This is a typical Eucalyptus remota site at 6 years post-fire. The mallee stems and trees are a bit more widely dispersed with more open area for shrubby growth. And in the diversifolia, generally there's a higher density of mallee trees, and it's much quicker regrowth and stronger density, and it's really hard to get through some of these sites in comparison to what we were finding with the remoter. So it's a different soil type primarily, I think, but they're still classified as 1 MBS. So. Okay, overall, across all the surveys, we found 186 species. 116 of these were present prior to the fire, and after the fire we found 166 species. So that's equating to that there were 20 species that disappeared with that large-scale bushfire, and 70 new species were recorded in these sites. You can see that in the red bars prior to the in the red bars prior to the fire there was a higher species richness, but that was 10 sites versus 6, so you may expect that. But this trend was reversed post-fire because there was quite a strong recruitment that happened in eucalyptus diversifolia populations. And even though there's only 6 versus the 10 here, there's quite a strong increase in species richness there. If you look at that at just a site level, even though we're getting a higher species richness in diversifolia, at the site level there's still less species richness per site than what we're getting at remota. So that's sort of suggesting that as you go from site to site, there's a range of new species coming in, which is actually adding up to a larger number of species overall, which is not quite as strong a trend in the remota. And you can see pre and post-fire means here is quite consistent, more than double post-fire in these two diversifolia sites, which is really encouraging. So there's a lot of life left in the seed bank that's happening, and some of those sites were up to about 45 years time since fire. If we look at this in an MDS plot, look at Bray-Curtis similarities of the presence-absence, which basically says the distance between the spots on this indicate how similar they are together. So really close together is similar, and further apart is less similar. So you can see with the eucalyptus remota populations all grouping very tightly. There's a definite shift with pre and post-fire, so there's a new range of species coming in which has shifted the post-fire off to the left in this plot. But diversifolia, as we thought maybe from those previous diagrams, is doing something a little bit different. It's quite widespread. The pre and post-fire ones are actually grouping together. It's one site over time, but the actual sites are a fair bit different to one another. To get an indication of how this difference is happening, I looked at a beta diversity measure. So a site diversity generally, pretty basically, is what you might consider an alpha diversity. The overall regional diversity is gamma diversity, and the change between sites in space I've defined as beta diversity in this case. And differences from one site to another can occur because of two different processes. The first can be turnover, which you're going from site A to site B, and there's a set of new species at site B that weren't at site A, so that's resulting in a difference. But you can also get something known as nestedness, where site B is really just a subset of all the species that are at site A, so there's no new species coming in. So it's interesting to know what the differences are there, and it can be a combination of both as well, obviously. I used an R package called BetaPart to analyse this presence-absence data. There's a couple of routines in there that they look at the spatial variation in diversity within a sample year, and also comparing the sites pre-fire to themselves post-fire to see what impact that disturbance has had, just to get an idea of sort of what's happening with that diversity there. When we look at that, the obvious thing there is that so we've got percent dissimilarity up the side. Both vegetation types, as you go from site to site, there's a fair bit of variation happening. As we may have predicted, the diversifolia sites have more variation in space than do the other ones. And the thing we're noticing is that a large blue proportion of each of these bars indicating there's a strong turnover component, so there's new species coming in as you move from place to place, which are equating to that whole gamma diversity, which is making it reasonably high. And the actual nested component is fairly small in these, so there's some common species which are occurring and being nested, and variations of that through the system. When we look at the temporal variation, what we're seeing is that obviously these are less dissimilar because you're comparing a site to itself at a later time, so obviously some of the species that are there that are okay with fire are just going to come back again, so that's why you're getting a larger red component in these. And the diversifiable populations, obviously, as we saw, there was quite a strong recruitment in there. That's equating to this higher component here. And that graph and the previous graph were just for spring 2004 and spring 2013 as an example. So the other years have similar trends. Okay, some of the conservation challenges. As I said, MVS is a fairly coarse unit compared to some of the veg mapping that we do have and some of the veg mapping that occurs across this part of the island. There is a latter revision which has some new MVS classes, and some of these have changed. So when we review our ecological fire management guidelines, we'll have to look at what impact that has in terms of this sort of thing. So it doesn't matter when applying EFMGs, you've got a strongly variable population, so potentially. And the scale at which we apply these things can be fairly important. At the moment, we assess that 30-40-30 breakdown of the guidelines primarily based at a fire management plan level, which is a group of reserves in a particular region. And there's been quite heated discussion over a number of years about whether that's the appropriate scale to be trying to calculate what's a good proportion of breakup of age since fire. So, and that discussion is still going on. And this is work from a fairly contiguous bit of vegetation. In the Mount Lofties, obviously there's a much more fragmentation, and it becomes a lot more challenging to try and balance those numbers in little fragments, and particularly when you're getting life and property protection as well. So essentially, the guidelines, I mean, it's a fairly blunt tool. It's a guide, really, it's a guidelines. So it needs a bit of a skilled operator working with it to consider a whole range of other things like risk, threatened species, the actual geographical layout of whether it's fragmentation and those sorts of things. So it's the thing that we grapple with constantly, really. And the guidelines need review. There's a whole lot of new information that's coming out in relation to fauna and fire, which we need to pull into it and help make us do better decisions, I guess, around this thing. And I guess if you're potentially missing out on some species that don't come back, whether you're a must-save all species or you want an ecosystem functional protection sort of camp, may depend on how you react to that. And where to from here? This highlights the importance of the seed bank. There's an amazing hidden diversity, and I think some of the previous stuff in Nerifoli on Kangaroo Island has highlighted some of that stuff as well. That there's amazing diversity still sitting in the soil that hasn't been seen for some time. The area has a fairly complex fire history. There's an indication that obviously time since fire reduces species richness, and there's a trend, but the number of fires doesn't seem to pull out as a trend at all. Be good to compare the bird diversity it's going through and see how that matches up with the plant changes and so forth. And Victoria they had the 5% burning target, where they pretty well burnt 5% of everything, and they've cancelled that now after much lobbying, and they've gone through more of an ecosystem resilience type process where one of the things they're trying to do is calculate that ideal growth stage distribution, so our 30-40-30 in our case, using the geometric mean abundance of a whole range of compositional species, both plants and fauna. So I'm not totally au fait with how that works as yet, but we're going to chase up with them what they're doing with that process and how they're getting that to work, and perhaps have a look at that when we do our review of the way that we do our ecological fire burning in relation to those ecological guidelines. And that was that. Thank you very much.
We might just save our questions for day 2 until we've got a break coming up soon.